Test. Yeah, we're good. All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started. So my name is Erika Noerenbe, and I'm going to be talking about some malware that I researched recently over the last few months called Schlayer. Now it's not working. That's fantastic, of course. You test it, and then it stops. All right, I guess we're going to be manual. There we go. All right. So I'm going to be talking about this malware. I wanted to talk about how it started before digging into the details about it. And then we'll just talk about some detection prevention stuff, and we'll have some time for questions. Oh, there we go. Now it started working. So who am I? Like I said, Erika Noerenbe. I've been in the security industry for a while now. Started out mostly like digital forensics and reverse engineering. Also did some firmware analysis and iOS programming back a long time ago, iOS 5. So it's been a while. I've been at Carbon Black for about a year. Before that, I was at a company called Logarithm, and but spent a few years before that at DC3, which is the Defense Cybercrime Center, in their intrusions department, which we basically investigated defense network intrusions. So any sort of either federal entity or some of the DIB partners, so Defense Industrial Base, your Lockheed, your Boeing, those types of people, if they had some sort of intrusion, they would send us the malware or the systems to investigate, to do forensics and malware analysis on them. And my Twitter handle is gutterchurl, but if you can find my name somewhere or remember how to spell it, possibly, if you Google me, I'm literally the only Erika Noerenbe, so it's kind of hard to hide. So back in November, this is how this all started. I'm sitting on my couch with my husband, and I've got a Manhattan. We're watching a movie or something, and my phone lights up with a Slack notification from my coworker. And so Jimmy sends me this message. He's like, he's an avid home brewer. And so he said, I was looking for this beer recipe, this stout recipe, and I stumbled on this thing that's serving out these what look like fake Flash downloads. And so it's, asking him to install a Flash update. It's like, yeah, this is probably malware. Thanks for turning me on to it. So I kind of pulled a few down, looked at it, I was like, yeah, this is definitely malware. What are we going to do with this? And so he sent me the site again. He said, look at this whole site. This whole website is just owned. So I start looking into it, and I'm like, this domain isn't even registered. Like, it's expired. Years expired. So what's going on with all of this? So over the months, so that was back in November, right? Didn't really have a lot of time or resources to develop, to devote to this. So kind of poked around at a few samples, tried to see if there were some other sites or if I could find some stuff on VirusTotal, but it didn't really have a whole lot of time because we had a lot of stuff going on. So I'd kind of come back around to it every few weeks, just kind of check it out. It was still serving stuff out. December, so January comes around, and I'm doing a blog post on Windtail, which is another OS X malware. And I stumble on this article from Sentinel-1 researcher, Philip Stokes, that was about how Windtail and other malware will bypass Gatekeeper in macOS. So, this is really interesting. And then I noticed there was a little snippet of a script that was in his blog post. And it wasn't really made much mention of in detail, but it was in this Windtail article. And I was like, holy crap, is this Windtail? Is this related to Windtail? Because that would be pretty big, 'cause it's kind of like a, I don't like the word nation state, advanced actor, targeted attack. It's like, wow, if we just happened to stumble on this, it's pretty big. So this is the actual script that I had found. This is blown up here. So this is the one that, from one of the samples that I had pulled down from this homebrewing site. And it basically is just a very simple bash script that will pull down this marsupials.zip. This particular domain was also serving out kittens.zip and porcupines.zip and any number of these things that contained Schlayer, as I found out later. But basically it does a curl, just a simple curl command, which if you're not familiar with it, is just a command line utility for downloading, kind of like wget, if you're familiar with that as well, for Mac and Unix systems.
So very simple. Pulls down this zip file, unzips it. It's a .app, Mac OS app. Unzips it with a password, removes the temporary stuff, and then just opens the app so that the user doesn't have to actually interact with it. So here's the clip from Philip's article. This is the clip that he actually had put into his blog post. And I mean, it was almost verbatim. Same thing. Kittens.zip, which I had actually, this is a different, I don't know what that IP address resolved to at the time, but I was able to pull down the same file from the AWW 799 domain as well. So this gets me going. I'm like, this is really exciting, right? If we found something and just stumbled on this thing that's like an advanced threat, that'd be really awesome. So like, yes, maybe this isn't just adware. Maybe it's actually something interesting. Because if you've ever done any malware analysis for Macs, almost all of it is actually adware. So I went down the rabbit hole. So that was on a Friday, and I spent the rest of the evening basically pulling apart some of the samples that I'd found, pulling down everything I could, looking at virus total, just kind of trying to get an idea of this. But I was talking to my coworker Greg, and he's like, why don't we try to script this to try to pull down as many samples as we can? So he threw together a Python script that basically uses Selenium to automate loading loading this one site. And the site used a system of redirects. And so we had to follow the redirects until we could detect that a flash update was being served out, and then automatically pull down that payload. And so this worked for a while. Basically what he would do, once he decided that, or once he determined that a malicious site was found, he would pull down the URL, pull down the source code for the page, take a screenshot of it, and then try to download the payload as well. So this was all automated. So right around February, that was January. Again, the script kind of went cold because the actors, from the time we first saw it in November, they kept putting in more mitigations to try to keep people from pulling these things down automatically. So at first, they were detecting IP addresses. So if the same IP address hit the site more than once in, 10 minutes or something like that, it would redirect you to something else. And then they put in some like CAPTCHAs. They've put in detection for IP ranges. So this was continually evolving, but we still didn't really think it was all that interesting, because when I went down the rabbit hole of Windtail, I realized it's like, okay, no, this actually isn't related. I just misread the article. This is something completely different. But then in February, we're like, we've been looking at this thing for 4 months now, and we haven't seen any sort of research about this anywhere else. So we're going to have to name this thing. If we're going to, write a blog post about it, if we're going to do any sort of research, if we're going to be talking about this thing, we need to name it. So the original homebrewing site that we found it on was called Double Docs, double as in the beer, D-U-B-B-E-L. And at the time we were having a heated debate about IPAs, because a lot of people hate IPAs, have very strong feelings about them. And one of them used to be my coworker, Brian Baskin, who spoke earlier. And so I just wanted to mess with him. And I was like, how about double IPA then? I know doubles don't have anything to do with IPAs, but I just wanted to mess with him. So we decided to call it double IPA. And so then it's like, okay, there's actually been this, evolution going on. And in February, I was like, oh, I found this article from a year ago, from February 2018, where the Tego researchers had actually found this before. And so they were calling it Schlayer. I was like, I think this is all the same thing. I think we've probably got Schlayer here. This is not new, unfortunately. And here's the article from Tego. I was like, maybe they're not just actually sophisticated. It's just another version of this Schlayer crap. Like, so exciting and total bummer. Totally bummed we don't get to use the name double IPA. And so our boss said, maybe we can just say it's a different campaign. It's the double IPA campaign from Schlayer.
But when we started looking at the distribution methods and all these things, it's like this has been an ongoing campaign clearly for the last year, and they've just been spreading it out over different ad sites and things like that. So it's like we can't use this name. But, I mean, we had the Slack channel set up, dedicated, everything, very exciting. Yeah, no. So it was a total bummer, but it was still pretty cool because nobody had really talked about it for the past year. Aside from that one mention from Philip Stokes in his Windtail article, which was from I think November or something of last year. So despite the fact that this wasn't anything new, we started looking as well, we thought this was kind of this one-off thing, but then it's okay, this is a large ad network that's serving out all of these things. This is going a lot deeper than we thought at first. So, maybe we should take a look in our customers' environment. And as we did that, it was wow, this thing is pervasive. And especially for the fact that it actually requires user intervention, we were very surprised to find how many infections there actually were across the base that we looked at. So we said, we really need to do something about this and get the word out and tell people how to get rid of it and put some detections in place. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the technical analysis because you'll see why, what makes this a little bit more difficult in terms of detection and remediation. On the one hand, it's very easy, but on the other hand, they've put protections into place that make it a little bit more difficult for the analyst or for the the SOC analyst. So anyway, what is it? Like I said, it was initially discovered by researchers from Tego back in January of 2018. And then we saw it in November and started looking at it. At that time, we didn't know what the family was. But then in February, we saw this crazy amount of infections and said, we've got to do something about this. And when I was looking into the malware further, we found out my coworker Jimmy was doing a lot of work with MITRE ATT&CK and the framework. He does more applied research stuff. And I was telling him about this privilege escalation technique that it uses. He's like, we don't, and we've been trying to put, MITRE ATT&CK IDs and things like that into our posts for customers because a lot of people are pulling those in and using them. Well, this doesn't really fit under any of the current attack IDs that are existing right now. So we ended up actually applying to MITRE, writing it up for them, and there's not an ID assigned just yet, but they have accepted it into the framework, so there will be a privilege escalation attack ID coming, I think in the next one probably. But it's basically based on an API called Authorization Execute with Privileges, which is a deprecated API in macOS, but because it can be abused this way to gain root privileges basically on the system. But so Apple deprecated this API and put a safer replacement in, but nobody really wants to employ the safer one because it's apparently very hard to instrument, and so they have to rewrite and refactor a lot of code in order to implement the safe version. So a lot of people still use this. And so they can't just completely cut this off, this API, because it would break practically all the programs that are out there right now. So, like I said before, Greg wrote this script to scrape the sites that we knew that were serving Outslayer. And the Selenium script would pull down the samples, pull down the code. Here's just his script saying the pop-up is detected. Here's the URL. We're going to write all this stuff out to a file. But like I said, they were getting smarter. And so by February, they were actually hosting all of these payloads, the final stage payloads, on S3, on Amazon, AWS. So, you're not going to block Amazon in your environment, right? I mean, most dev shops are using that legitimately. So they start doing this. They start making it harder to determine these payloads, and they moved things around on the screen, so the Selenium's not really working anymore. And they started redirecting to this www9.doubledocs.com, which if you've ever seen one of those things, if you've typed in something, typed a URL in wrong and somebody's squatting on a mistyped domain, you get this kind of fake search page kind of thing. So that's what they would redirect to if they thought that you were trying to work the system, basically. So we had set up a whole thing of rotating proxies to try to get around the IP range detection. So we'd hop, to different countries, sleep for 5 minutes, go to a new country, try it again, but eventually this stopped working. However, like in the very beginning, it actually was very successful. So that first day that I ran the script, that Greg and I were running it, we were actually able to pull down, I think, about like 28 or 30 samples just in a few hours from this site before they started putting the mitigations in place. And out of that, we had about 15 unique samples. And it's a little hard to see here, but basically we had there were identical hashes that were being served out on different views, like different sites. So they would change up how it looked, which I'll show you in a little bit. So here's an example. This is one of those like fake search sites that you kind of see. And this is what you get redirected to if it thinks that you're trying to mess with it. Let's see. I wonder if I can. Can we do oh, it's not going to let me do that. Oh. No, it's not going to let me do that. Thought maybe we could see what happens. But basically, if you go to this site, it'll either redirect you through a system of different ad network proxies, or you'll get this dummy page here. So the distribution, as I said, we first discovered it on this Homebrew site, and we found that it was utilizing a whole network of expired domains to squat on and serve out these ads. So it'd take a legitimate domain that had legitimate content at one point, but the domain had expired. And when you go to it again, now it's got this ad chain that will eventually take you to, usually most of them were fake Flash update installers. So you would go to this site that you thought, maybe you'd been to it 6 months ago, maybe you had it bookmarked from a long time ago. You go to it again and it says, oh, hey, you need to update your Flash to see this page again. And so unfortunately a lot of people fall into this trap, and so they install it. So most of these, some of them were also browser extensions. So it would actually look like the Chrome browser extension store, but in actuality, there was another thing going on underneath. The other common distribution method for this was in cracked software. So if you look at torrents for, let's say somebody wants Photoshop, they go to download a cracked version of Photoshop because they don't want to pay for the license, and they get served with Schlayer instead. Some of these things, especially the Flash updates, some of them will actually, after installing the malware, they will actually go through the additional installation of Flash, which is pretty funny because when you're going through the malware installation, it'll actually say install complete, and then you click again and it starts installing again to install the real Flash. So it's like, but people still fall for this. So when I was looking into this domain thing, we couldn't figure out, there's no way to report abuse when there's no person running the website. So like, how do we tell these people that these websites are hijacked? And, I was talking to somebody from VeriSign, and she said that hosting companies like GoDaddy, they get a huge list of all of these parked domains where there are people parking on these expired domains on a weekly or monthly basis, I forget, and it's up to them to do something about it. So as you can imagine, they don't really have a lot of incentive to do anything about it because, it's just a domain sitting out there into the ether. They don't really have any incentive to shut these down. So they pretty much just keep going. And when I was researching this just about a month ago, kind of preparing these slides, I decided to go back to DoubleDocs again, to the original site that we saw. And I was looking at the page source, and I noticed that there was a bunch of CSS code for this parkingcrew.net. I was like, what is this? Well, it's apparently there's something called domainers. This is completely outside of my expertise, but there are these domainers that specialize. You can actually pay them to park domains for you.
And so they will just give you a set of domains that you can put your ads or your, whatever you want to on it. So it's a huge industry, apparently, because they make money off of it. So, but there's really not, at this point, there's not really any good way to stop it. So here's one sample site. This is one of the things when you go to one of these ad sites. This is a sample page that you would get redirected to. So as you'll see, they actually utilize, they take some user agent information from the system so that they can cater this to the particular person that's looking at the website. So this knew that my system is 10.14, it's Mojave. They tell me I'm infected, and do you want to start a scan? The interesting thing about this is that this entire page is actually completely valid. All of these links are exactly what you would think they were. Go down here, you can buy AppleCare. That'll actually take you to Apple's AppleCare site where you can buy AppleCare. All of these links up here are exactly as Apple's site would be. The only custom content is this right here. So this is a good example of social engineering. They're trying to make the page look as valid and believable to the user as possible. Not an uncommon thing, but I thought this one was interesting because a lot of times they don't go to this much effort of actually mapping the entire page. But it works. People fall for it. And so that's why you continue to see these things. Because the more believable it is, the more likely that your user is going to click on it and trust the content. So here's just a few. These are all the different examples of different pages that are serving out this malware. This is all the same malware, sometimes the same hashes, sometimes different hashes, but same thing. But they just make the pages look different, so you're not seeing the same thing over and over again. And this here is one of the examples of the extensions that I was talking about. So as you can see up here, well, you can't see it, but this is actually going to the Chrome extension store, Chrome web store. So if you look at it at face value, it says, oh, okay, you need to add this to Chrome. It's this legitimate extension. And I didn't really think too much of it because I was focusing on the malware, on the .apps and the Flash updates and stuff. But one time I was going back to my VM, my analysis VM, and I just happened to move, I was going to try to move this screen out of the way. And I noticed that that's actually just another window that's placed on top. So this is the actual Chrome web store. But if you click down here on the security check and try this again, try my download again, this is a completely separate page, and this is actually the malware page back here. This is doubledocs.com. So I actually happened on this completely by accident because I wasn't even caring about the browser extensions at that point. I was like, oh, all right. So yeah, social engineering at its best. Some of these samples also actually had JavaScript and were bundled with a crypto mining component. And this is just an illustration of one of the systems running this. You can see this is kind of normal behavior. And once the crypto mining component gets installed, the CPU usage spikes. The crypto mining components are a little bit harder to find, but that's generally the first thing that's kind of an indication that something's going wrong because your usage goes way up. I mean, Chrome is enough of a hog, so you can imagine it doesn't always flag for people. But so the other interesting thing, and I got in trouble for this the last time I talked about this, but this is my former coworker, Adam, and he hit me up a month or two ago. He was like, hey, check this out. I was just Googling my name, and look at this link down here at the bottom. It's like, oh yeah, I went to it, and I was like, oh, sure enough, it's serving out Schlayer. And my other coworker, Casey, had said, hey, I was searching for Python 7-zip extract or something, looking for some code documentation. And, halfway down the page of search results was a random link that it'll actually show you, it looks like, something from Stack Overflow or something, the description. This one is pretty fake looking, but some of the ones that I found, which unfortunately I didn't screenshot, it looks like a valid result that you would have, maybe some code snippets or like a forum link or something like that. But when you actually go to it, it takes you to one of these flash updates. So it seems like they're paying for AdWords somehow, working into it, because as we've been watching it over the last month or two, it'll be in completely random searches. Some things will show up and some things, it's not, all the links are valid, but you never know. So I don't really know how they're working that, but it is pretty interesting that you'll just see these in random Google searches. So I want to go through one of the samples and just briefly walk through the execution of this malware, just so that you kind of have an understanding of what it's doing and how it works. This one variant, like I said, there were several different types. Some of them were basically just bash scripts. Some of them were apps. Some of them were ISOs. I'm going to take one that was, we're going to walk through one that was actually a DMG. So if you're not real familiar with Mac, DMG files are like a disk image that gets mounted, and that usually has your installer in it to install an application. So in this particular case, this one had a DMG that once you mounted it and executed it, there was a hidden directory that got created that contained a .command file, which is basically a script. And there's multi-layers of decoding and execution that occur before the final payload actually gets installed. So the very first script actually decodes and decrypts another encoded script, which decodes another embedded script, which then also tries to download the final payload and execute it. Once that's actually executed, it attempts to escalate privileges and get root on the system. The most interesting thing to me about these were that all of the payloads, the final payloads and the initial payloads, all signed with valid developer IDs, valid Apple developer IDs, valid certificates. So, gatekeeper and your normal protections are kind of out. If the user is going to authenticate against this, nothing on the system is going to prevent it, because it says you've got a valid certificate, it's a valid developer. You're not going to get that pop-up if you use a Mac. This application was not from, you downloaded it from the internet. It's not a valid developer, blah, blah. You're not going to get that warning at all. So that's just one more step of trying to make, it's not question time, Joe.
Do you think they scale these IDs?
No, they're actually registering them. So I'll actually talk about that a little bit later. But I did have a big discussion with Apple, who was actually very helpful. And I said, I started trying to hunt down all these IDs, because I was like, okay, well, why don't I just go to VirusTotal and see if I can pull down some of these samples. And it was very easy. It's very easy to identify the samples. But you start looking at them, like, I'm just going to try to start harvesting these developer IDs. And you start looking at it, and it's almost like, if anybody's familiar with malware in general, if you've heard of domain generation algorithms. So basically, it's a way of generating kind of a random domain for use so that they can just kind of automatically generate these things. The developer ID names were generated like that. So they're very random sounding. Sometimes it'll be like a last name sounding for the first name. There was like a Maxwell Brooklyn, and but I'll get a little bit more to that in a bit. But that was one of the interesting things I thought. So Apple had actually been revoking certs, and they've been pretty good about revoking certs, so they don't stay alive for very long. But the actual malware developers are churning them out so fast that they just recycle, just make a new cert and make a new cert. So Apple hadn't been revoking the developer IDs at the time, but now they've actually started revoking the IDs as well. Because that one that I was talking about, Maxwell Brooklyn, I told them, I was like, this ID has been signing this malware for close to a year now without being revoked. And yeah, you're revoking the certs, but the ID is still valid. So I'm hoping that some of this is going to be mitigated when they've actually just officially rolled out notarization. So Apple now, if you're a new developer, you have to go through an additional step to notarize and get your application approved. So hopefully that'll, mitigate some of that. But back to the malware. So this is an example of the first encoded script. It's a little hard to see, but basically you've got a giant chunk of this base 64 encoded looking stuff.
And it's a very simple script that will base64 decode and then decrypt this code that's will turn out to be the second script. And the interesting thing is this password. There's a password that's used with the decryption, and it's actually hard-coded into all of these samples. And when I was talking to a former colleague about it, who's also been tracking this, he said that it seems to be kind of like a timestamp type of related thing. And if you track them, when I looked back at the samples from over the months, you can see that the number increases. So I think that it's based on some sort of timestamp or something. But basically, this is hard-coded per sample. And so when you run this, I'm going to be talking about the behavior a little bit later. So this happens to be just a clip from our product response, just to show you the child processes. But you'll see this base64 and OpenSSL as an artifact of this execution for the first stage of encryption. So this, or the first script. So again, this second script is what's decoded by the first one. Again, a big chunk of base64 that gets base64 decoded, and then they actually use XXD, which, if you're not familiar, is a command line hex editor tool that's on Unix and FreeBSD systems. And so they use this basically to format and write out the third and final script before pulling down the final payload. And so again, that same screenshot, you'll see the process artifacts from this execution of the base64, the OpenSSL, and the XXD, which when taken together is not a very common combination of things to run in a normal environment. So this third script is actually just a pretty simple bash script, more akin to that one that I showed at the very beginning. They do a little bit more complicated stuff with checks and checking the volumes that are mounted and some different things like that. But all in all, it's doing the same thing. It is going to try to download the final payload, which is a zip, password-protected zip. Again, this password is the same password that was used in the first step, the decryption. Or no, I'm sorry, that's a different password. I'll get back to the password thing later. But basically, it uses curl, again, to download a zip file. It's going to unzip this, and that's an actual Mac app, .app. It's going to open that and try to install the malware, and then it deletes everything all the temporary files from before the zip and everything else. So let's take a look at these URL components. So this is actually what's passed into curl. You've got the URL, but then there's these components in the URL that are consistent across all the samples of this malware. So the first one we were calling a campaign ID. This is not unique. We tried for a while. We thought, well, maybe there's some sort of, these are based on a target or some sort of campaign targeting certain people or certain industries or, And so we started grouping all of these that we saw, but we couldn't really find any sort of patterns. So I think it's just probably just a set campaign ID for a certain set of hashes that are generated. The U equals is a unique ID for that system, and it's based on IO platform UUID, so it's basically something you can run from that you can pull from the system information for a given host. S similarly is another unique ID. It's just, we're calling it a session ID. That's just a straight results from running the command UUID gen from the command line. And then you've got O, which is the OS version and patch level. So in this case, it was 10.12.5. And then that encryption key, which is hard-coded. So that's that password that I was talking about before. So that actually gets passed into the URL as well, so that the attackers can actually track this stuff. So here's another look at the net connection. Again, you'll see the actual call. This is actually from a system that was infected, and the actual call to curl and the execution of the malware itself. But up here, you can't read it here in this slide, but you'll see this is a screenshot from our product. It tells you this file is signed by Dominguez Wawa. So that's another developer ID. yeah, Dominguez Wawa. I don't think I've ever met a Dominguez, but this actually comes through. You can see the check, and the malware actually will, before doing the final execution, it will run SPCTL, which is a command line program that will let you check the certificate status for a given binary. And so it'll actually run that itself, and if the certificate's been revoked, it'll kill itself. So it will not run if that particular sample has been revoked. So the interesting thing about that is when I started looking on VirusTotal, you can find hundreds and hundreds of samples of this daily. Different hashes. Every single sample uploaded exactly once. So it seems as though the malware authors are actually just hitting VirusTotal to say, okay, am I getting detected? Is my cert revoked? What's the status here? And once they get, a certain number of detections, then they can flip it, use another developer ID, generate new certificates, generate new hashes, and continue. So they're continually hitting VirusTotal with these things. And if you pull them down from VirusTotal, a lot of times the certs have already been revoked, even, a day later. But Apple's been working really hard at getting control of that stuff. So kudos to them. But I wanted to talk a little bit about this privilege escalation. So once that actual second stage is executed, it tries to escalate privileges with sudo and invoking this tool called security auth trampoline, which as a result of running security auth trampoline, one side effect of that is that it invokes a program called UID, which is a system utility, but it's not something that's run it's not something that you'd run from a command line. It's more of a utility that the system would use. And so because security auth trampoline is set UID root, if you're familiar with like Linux or Mac, this program is set UID root. So one consequence of running security auth trampoline is that this UID gets invoked as well. And so if you see, UID being run in your environment, a lot of times it's going to be something to look into because we haven't found any it's not a common thing that would be associated with legitimate activity. So it's kind of another behavioral indicator. So I mentioned this briefly before, the authorization execute with privileges API. I'm not going to go into detail about this because it gets down into the weeds a lot. And if you're familiar with Patrick Wardle, he's a Mac security researcher. And he did a very, very good talk a couple years ago, DEF CON 25, called Death by 1,000 Installers. Highly recommend if you're interested in this kind of thing. He goes into it in depth, basically what happens behind the scenes when this API call gets called. This is that deprecated API that I was talking about at the beginning. So as a result of this API, that security auth trampoline gets triggered and set UID and that whole process. So I highly recommend that talk if you're interested in that kind of thing. So I just wanted to quickly, to end up, talk about how do we detect and prevent this. Because the whole problem of the valid developer IDs, it's going to get around your basic protections. And if you're looking in your security products, like when we first looked, it was like, well, this isn't necessarily flagging. It's not really standing out as something that's malicious behavior because you've got curl, you've got XXD, you've got all these, lol bins, the living off the land binaries. They're all legitimate system applications just being used in a bad way. So how do you actually detect this when you've got a valid certificate, valid dev ID, and you're using valid binaries? So I have to go to the attack, the obligatory attack page. But for the people that we have a lot of customers that are relying on or using attack to kind of try to classify things. These are some of the attack IDs that are involved. The privilege escalation was the interesting one, and like I said, they have accepted it. It'll probably be in the next release. There's not an attack ID associated with it now, but there should be probably in the next month. But we've got execution, defense evasion with the hidden bash scripts and things like that, and then discovery with system data, kind of system information gathering. But the Death by 1,000 Installers was the talk that I was telling you about with by Patrick Wardle. But basically, when the second stage payload, the final stage payload is executed, the user has to authenticate. So this isn't, even though it's using this this API, you don't get around the authentication. It still does have to be authenticated, and you do have to have an admin user. So you can actually mitigate this with restricting privileges on your systems. But at least in my experience, a lot of shops that are running Macs give admin privileges to their users, and they're not restricting it. So if the user is going to install it, then you're going to get this privilege escalation, and suddenly now they've got root. So even though this is actually adware, people say, oh, well, it's just adware. I don't really care. It's not like it's malware. It's not exfiltrating data off my system. Why do I care? Well, you have to remember that this thing has root access, and it can literally download. So once the final stage is installed, it will download additional adware and install it on the system. So at any point in time, it's got access. It's got a backdoor to install whatever it wants to. So in the hands of the right adversary, if they've got all your system information, they know, anything about your system, who's using it. If there's a CEO, because we know that a lot of the higher level people are the ones that are running Macs. If there's somebody that they wanted targeted, they've got all that system information. They can say, yeah, that's that guy. Let's download something else onto his system. Personally, I haven't seen it, but it is something that could happen because they've got full system access. So, it's not something to be dismissed. Anything that's got root on the system should be a concern, obviously. But as far as behavioral indicators, I talked a little bit about the XXD, the OpenSSL, and curl. Those by themselves, XXD, OpenSSL, XXD probably used by a lot of your, maybe devs, people like that doing lower level stuff in your environment, not too uncommon. OpenSSL also probably used by some of your admins, your sysadmins, to automate scripts, automate things with certs. Not uncommon. Curl also, devs and sysadmins, used in automation. But the combination of the three of them with base64, you have to start looking at, okay, it's not this individual tool itself, but when I put these things together, that starts to paint a picture of something bigger that's going on. And these don't necessarily make sense in, let's say, somebody from the sales department, is probably not running XXD. And certainly not XXD, base64, curl, all of these things. UID again, in conjunction with security off trampoline. Security off trampoline in this case is a module that's loaded via AppleScript, and it's from, in this case, a user writable location. Also not something that's going to be common. Security off trampoline by itself, yeah, it's used, it's invoked by some applications when escalating privileges, but it's not a common thing in this context. So we said, why don't we take one of these things and can we figure out we need to figure out some way to narrow this down and identify where this malware is actually installed. Well, we can't look at any of these. When we look at any of these tools by themselves, so in this case, literally just saying process name is curl. Like, where is curl running in my environment? And if you think of each one of these squares as a cluster of machines, so say that's, 10,000 machines, each one of these squares, the darker the square, the higher percentage of those machines are running this utility at some point in the given time. So I think this was actually over a month. So you can see that there's quite heavy usage across all of these clusters of machines for curl just in general. So they said, well, this malware uses kind of interesting and unusual command line arguments to curl. So why don't we zero in on that and see how that changes? Like maybe we can narrow it down at least. And this turned out to be a very, very good high fidelity indicator for this malware and continues to be. So basically, we've still got the process name of curl, but we added the command line arguments of -f0l, which is what they run. And you can see, I mean, there's barely any. And I can tell you that these results, 99% Schleyer. There were two results that were not, that were false positives, and it was a download of like a software antivirus update for like a VAST or something like that. But in every other case, it was the malware that was running. So these command line options, F, fail silently. Okay, not so uncommon. You know, people probably use that. -0 though, using HTTP 1.0. So who's going to restrict, like specifically restrict their curl downloads to HTTP 1? Not very common. And then -L is to follow the redirects. Because like I said, you know, it was hopping. So the combination of the curl and these specific arguments are a very, very high fidelity indicator. So this was just one of the ones that we found. This I just thought was hilarious. I saw this the other day. So this is, I think this is actually regarding Adobe, Acrobat. But you can see all of these CVEs. This is a list of how many CVEs. So if you're not familiar with CVE, it's a common vulnerability exploitable. Yeah. Basically, it's all the exploits. They're catalogs of exploits that are available for a product. So this is a list in one Adobe update of how many CVEs that are actually patched in one update. Again, this is Adobe Reader, or Acrobat, but it applies to Flash as well. Flash is notorious for vulnerabilities.
So they fixed them anymore?
Yeah, they're all gone. Yeah. So in this thread later, a lot of you, if you follow Twitter, you're probably familiar with Malware Tech. He was the guy that discovered the kill switch for WannaCry, and is now facing prison. But he said, waiting for Patch Tuesday and hoping that there will be something other than WhatsApp, because if you've been following the news, WhatsApp had this big thing about, you know, whatever. But then he said, I'm talking about Microsoft, not Adobe. Nobody cares about Adobe. Acrobat is a collection of vulnerabilities that somehow also renders PDFs. So true. So, although this is talking about Acrobat, the same thing goes for Flash. You know, these days, you know, it's really not needed. 99% of the time, you really don't need Flash, and you shouldn't install it. So what's the takeaway? Well, number one, don't install Flash. Just don't. And if you have to install Flash, get it from Adobe and make sure that it's actually signed by Adobe. Granted, that's still not fail-safe, but it's going to get a lot, you know, it's a lot better than, you know, just downloading from one of these things. Also, you know, Gatekeeper and Xprotect are not going to help you. These are the Gatekeeper and Xprotect are the Mac security built-in system mitigations. They're not going to help you when something is signed, the certs are valid, and the user executes it and authenticates it. You can't get around that. There's no security control for that. There's a huge network of hijacked domains, websites, and like I said, there's hundreds of these hashes being generated daily. So you can't chase these IOCs. You can't block, like I said, nowadays, that one site, they're serving it through AWS. You're not going to block Amazon AWS in your environment. You can't chase these domains and try to blacklist all of this. It's not going to work. So you have to rely on these behavioral indicators like I talked about. So here's some links, and I'm actually going to be putting out a blog post probably next week. We have a short one out there for anybody that's actually Carbon Black customers. We have like Carbon Black product specific mitigation stuff that's in the user exchange, and some scripts and things. But this is just all the links. Again, my handle on Twitter is GunnerTroll. Feel free to hit me up if you have questions. But I'd like to open it up if anybody has questions in general. We got like a couple minutes. Yes. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, so he asked, he said, you know, and this was my thought initially, an Apple developer idea is $100 a pop. And all of these domains, you have to pay for all these things. So you can imagine how profitable this thing must be in order for them to be cycling through developer IDs, domains, serving out all of these things. Yeah, and I don't know the answer. The thing is that, like I said before Apple was basically just banning hashes, so the same developer ID was working for a while, and they would just generate new certs. But now they've actually started revoking IDs as well, and hopefully, like I said, the notarization will take care of some of that as well. Yeah?
Does the adware components need root access? Or are they just saying, I got this far, let's just do root over here?
Yeah, so he said, asked if the adware actually requires root access. It does for the stage after the final stage, I guess. Basically, it downloads additional packages, and so for it to be able to download and install additional adware packages without user interaction, it needs to have that system level access. And so once they get past that initial gatekeeping, I don't want to use that word because it's not gatekeeper, but once they get past those initial max system mitigation techniques, it can do what it wants to. So, you have a question?
I was just saying that iOS active community is practically broken out that everybody actually gets their developer ID canceled.
Oh, really?
They get compromised, used to sign malware,
Right.
disabled, and they didn't have anything to do with it except using stupid passwords.
Right. Yeah. So he was making the point that developer IDs in general, Apple developer IDs are kind of notorious now for being revoked because people use stupid passwords and they get compromised and somebody starts using them for malware or things like that. So, yeah.
What do you think the downloaders require HTTP1?
That's a good question. I think that I'm just guessing, but I'm assuming that it was probably, because if you look at the ad sites like the one that we initially found, it's a non-secure server, and there's, I don't know if that's the way that they're getting around for the park domains, like how they're taking advantage of the domains that are expired. Yeah, it's not my. Exactly, and that's why, as an indicator, I'm like, I don't know why they're using it, but nobody else uses it legitimately. Right. Yeah, and so I haven't tested that. I'm not sure. But yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
Is there any significance to password protecting zip files than hard coding the password in?
I think because of if you've got network traffic monitoring, or like if you have some sort of like IDS system or things like that does packet inspection, it's just like if you're trying to send, well, one thing that I've done, sending malware to your friend, right? If you just try to send it through your email, it's probably going to get clipped. But if you password protect it and encrypt it, then it's more likely to get past filters. So.
Also substantially changes the signature of the zip every time.
Right. And so anytime that the password is changed, it's going to change the signature of the payload. So if you're relying on antivirus or things like that. Yeah. Right. And so that since it seems like it's kind of a timestamp based thing, it's probably just an automated generation of these payloads. But yeah. Questions? All right. Well, thank you very much.